essentially, masking is, in my experience, pushing down your individual needs and kind of like disassociating and allowing for without consent and without permission and without knowing how the damages it's going to cause you find it safer to be disassociative. And this is all perhaps even subconsciously, because there's a huge debate about whether it's a conscious decision or not to mask. But I think, and they just kind of move forward to make you look fine, safe, and just like all the other kids.
I really appreciate you joining us.
Either work or get related.
Why is this happening? What does the child need to express themselves?
How can we help understand them? Here's a way to look at autism in which your child is not a problem that needs to be fixed.
That's that shift in language that's so important.
Okay, hi Amber and Daniela. It's so nice to have you here with us today. I'm so excited to speak with both of you. And I know Tavia has some additions she would like to add. I would love if you could go ahead and introduce yourselves for our guests or for our audience.
Sure, I'll start. Thank you so much for having us. We're super excited to be here and to share a little bit about what we do. So my name is Amber Angel, and I am an occupational therapist by training. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. And I am currently an assistant professor at USC, at the University of Southern California, in the Chan Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy. And I run or direct the DREAMS Lab, which Daniela and I will talk about today. That stands for Disparity, Reduction, and Equity in Autism Services. And just briefly, who we are as a lab, we have students, clinicians, researchers, and we have a group that we call our ALEC group that stands for Autistic Lived Experience Collaborators. So we are made up of lots of different people who bring lots of different perspectives, and everyone contributes in some way to the research that we do. And I think Danielle, I'll let you speak to it, kind of your role in the lab and who you are.
Thanks, Amber. I'm Daniela Florendez. I work in the lab with Amber. We've been friends for many years, and I also consult for her research. I'm based out of Los Angeles, born and raised in the suburbs of North Los Angeles with my Peruvian father, and my very American mother identifies half Peruvian, half American. And I have a master's in public health, and I've been working with Amber for the last couple of years, sharing a little bit about autistic experiences and how they should be leading the narrative and leading the decision and really guiding research about autistic people, as I am myself, late identified autistic.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And would you also tell us who Tavia is and what her role is on your team as well?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So as I said, we have many wonderful members of the lab, but Tavia is another member of our ALEC group. And Tavia wanted to contribute with some answers that she has put in writing. And so I'm going to read her introduction. She said that she says, I am a single mom to an amazing young man who just happens to be on the autism spectrum. And in terms of her role in the group, she says, I provide a parent perspective and a perspective as someone who identifies as African American, European, and Indigenous Native American. And I'll just go ahead and read a little bit more about Tavia while I'm reading this. She began her work with us because she was seeking out various universities to see if they did any type of academic research regarding autism. And she randomly emailed different groups in hopes of being contacted. And she says, I was happy when Amber contacted me. I told her I would like to provide a Black perspective on some of the research that we're doing. I'll pause there. I think that's enough of an introduction for Tavia, but as we go, Taylor, if that's okay, I'll kind of like chime in with some of Tavia's answers to some of your questions.
Yes, absolutely. And I think going into how we talked about accommodations, I would love if you want to share about that, Daniela, that would be perfect.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm a little jealous right now of Tavia because my heart's beating a little fast, and I'm trying. Okay, yeah, and I'm just like, this is so smart of her. um smart isn't necessarily the right word. There's like this for awareness that some people have of like what you may need to have a more beneficial experience. And I guess I'm talking about accommodations. And so Tavia was aware that she would prefer to kind of write her answers, and have them spoken for her on her behalf. And that's something we do something we try to do, and I think more people should do, is ask about how someone prefers
Mm.
to kind of share their story and kind of share their ideas, because speaking isn't the only way. And actually, for me, as a late identified autistic person, speaking is kind of like my coping mechanism, and is almost this very like trauma created method I have of connecting with the world. It's not my innate preference. So as we speak, I'm like trying to modulate and moderate
Mhm.
my own like sense of panic, internal panic and stress. And so,
Right.
but I have experience doing it. So, you know, I'm a, anyway, does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah, and I wanna say that I really love how you said, speaking is not the only means of communication, because as a speech therapist, that is a
Mhm.
huge part of what we do, and, we work a lot with AAC, we, do the whole modality of communication, and that's now kind of a movement in the SLP world that is trying to push that forward, like, it's you know what? Communication is communication. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us.
As Daniela mentioned in the lab, we really try. We do our best to
Mhm.
always provide accommodations. And so I think some of your audience who are parents of autistic kids might start hearing words like that, right? And so just to
Mhm.
sort of give a picture of what that looks like in our lab and why we value it, is just like Daniela said, it's not only that different people, based on their brain and nervous system, might have different modes of communication that are more accessible or easier or preferred. But a lot of what, our lab members who kind of range, we have lab members who identify as autistic, we have lab members who identify as neurodiverse or neurodivergent, sort of more broadly. And so a lot of what they share is I might some moments prefer to speak and be able to speak, and that's how I want to communicate and express myself. There might be
Mm.
other moments where I'm overwhelmed or I'm dysregulated. My nervous
Mhm.
system is there's some kind of input that's overwhelming my nervous system, or I'm just having a bad day, or I'm feeling burnt out. And then it might be that I will choose to type my answers in the Zoom meeting where everyone is on screen, and we will read those out so that you don't need to speak. If you're conveying by typing it that that's how you need to communicate in the moment. We also welcome people to turn their cameras off if that's
Mhm.
overwhelming. We hold all of our meetings by Zoom because that's more accessible for all of our members. So there's different ways where we try to support participation, the full participation of everyone, every neurotype, right? So however your brain and nervous system work, we're trying to support full participation. And Daniela, as the consultant for the lab, is often helping me go, wait a minute, we could do this better. Wait a minute, let's rethink this. Oh, we were doing it this way, but it doesn't seem like it's working for this person anymore. So it's not like a set thing. It's kind of like an open conversation. And
Mhm.
the purpose, again, if your audience hears accommodations or accessibility, that's just a tool to help someone participate.
If I can
Yeah,
add too,
please.
is that for me, like I kind of touched upon, I didn't necessarily start out very verbal growing up. It was kind of like expected of me, certainly in my culture. Like it was considered really rude to not speak,
Mm.
and to not greet people and to kind of do these markers of a well raised little girl, which was like very important for my parents. So I speak very much sometimes in like metaphors, but I see it as kind of like you have just like one road out of your brain that I was like forced to use. Like it's one way down the mountain. And that means though that this like one way that I've been allowed to use like has weathered a lot of storms, right? So like when I'm upset about something, I also have, for example, a very strong sense of justice. Like I have to use this one road. I don't have any secret back roads to escape people because they were cut off from me as a child.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so it's like this one road. that I often confront you know, confront people and power with my words. I have just a long history of just like saying things even though I'm like certainly super frightened inside, but this is my only road I have felt I've always had to interact with the world that I was allowed to have. So, despite being frightened, I would say to someone's face, "You're not doing a good job." Like, because I'd have to tell someone the truth, especially if I felt it was hurting others. So, I guess I'm just trying to say that this is like a very battered road that has a lot of storms and trauma and potholes. But I'm also very familiar with this road. I could drive it blind, and I love this road. But it's like it's kind of both my salvation and also my
Mm,
cage of words. I don't know, I just wanted to explain to you that perspective, just that I am now at this point comfortable being very verbal, but it has a long history,
yeah.
and and no one would know that per se from looking at me. And then I also wanted to share, just even with these ideas of accommodations, that I can like feel my voice shaking a little bit. But there is always like a cost to this type of adaption or maladaption or coping or masking.
Mhm.
Like, not to like make anyone feel bad, but I will be kind of stressed tonight. Like I will like have to lower my nervous
Mhm.
system's arousal and adrenaline.
Mhm.
And that's the thing, like I haven't been taught how to do that, and I wasn't taught how to do that as a child. Like coping skills with big feelings or anything like that. So what I will do is like read until I'm exhausted, and then and then my body will just give out. And I'm working on it, and that's why I'm really interested in this, collision between speech therapy and OT, and that's also why I'm trying to share, because I think some people may be going through this, but they just don't know.
Mhm. Absolutely. Daniela, I had so many thoughts while you were speaking. First of all, thank you so much for sharing that. I think you are just, first of all, doing such a wonderful job of kind of explaining the nuances of this whole societal expectation. That's kind of, what came to mind while you were talking. It's like you mentioned, I think you said, well-raised little girl was kind of expected of you. And that's just such an interesting concept to me, because it's like, oh, we automatically, I'm sure, have like a picture, whatever that looks like. It might be a little different from person to person, but like, yeah, that brings up a picture of what you think that should be. So I love that you also mentioned masking, and you know you didn't necessarily know as a child that there was a different option, that, or you weren't given the um, freedom to explore different options either. So I think that's really powerful what you said, and I really appreciate you sharing that.
Of course, and it's just kind of like it's funny because everyone I know is like, if I can't talk about autism and late identified and masking, then I'm just kind of like, I don't know if I ruin every party, but I'm just like, "Do you wanna talk about autism? Are you like, I'm autistic." It's just all I can talk about right now, and so I'm happy to talk about it because 'cause I'm just obsessed with it. Um, and, there's more to share, and it's certainly my passion, this idea of autistic families
Mm.
and what culture and masking do to kind of, almost hide and put to a side, autistic children, specifically girls. And so that's kind of my niche, and it's what we're doing research on with Amber. So we can circle back 100 ways, but it's just kind of, you know, ironic, I guess is the word, that my research is also my life, and my life is my
Mm.
research. And it's all very personal to me, and I'm all very happy to be sharing, because I hate to think that people might be suffering through these things that I just felt like it was a miracle for me to figure out for myself anyway.
Mm-hmm. Um, and Daniela, would you be comfortable sharing your experience and how you discovered this? What actions did you take? Because I'm hearing this and wondering, like, if there are other adults who are feeling similarly, what can they do? Or,
Right.
younger children too, and even parents who, maybe want to recognize this in their own children. Knowledge is power. And so I'd love to hear about your experience.
Yeah, of course. So I have a career in public health and in research. And so I've been working in qualitative analysis. So that's the analysis of storytelling almost my whole career, which is now 10 to 15 years in at USC. And I worked at some point about 10 years ago now with autistic children, autistic boys and girls, and teens. And as soon as I worked with autistic children, I was like, oh, I was autistic, right? But even think of I like think of how I said that I was
Mm.
autistic, right? Like I identified who I was as a child very quickly to what I was seeing. I knew I walked on my toes. I used to spin. I used to touch things. Like as soon as I saw these children and I spent time with them because I was talking to their parents as part of research, for example, I just was like so seeing myself, and that was kind of like the first wall to fall down. um and then the other thing though is that I have a family member, I should say, because I don't want to identify her or she'll kill me, who was just like, no, but Daniela, you are not autistic. You are way too verbal and you're way too, like empathetic. Just like, which is like the nail in the coffin of ridiculous stereotypes, but the ones that really keep so many girls from their diagnosis and from their identification. Um, and I think there was so much trauma there, like I said, behavior, manners, coping, masking, and hiding as a culture, as my father's culture, because, autism is a totally different thing outside of this country. So I can completely understand why to bring this idea of autism into our home was just not what anyone was thinking to do. But it wasn't until the pandemic and everything kind of stopped that I was just like, oh, like it's completely quiet in my brain. I'm so relieved at no expectations, though horrified, of course, by the millions that are dying and have died and continue to die. Um, but like so relieved to not be out in the world. And I was like, what is that? And why? What is going on? Right. And so essentially it was this breakthrough of connecting with Amber, who was doing research on Latinx adults, girls, late diagnoses, and kind of she had like in her hand kind of like the composite of some stories. And I was just like, these are my stories, these are my experiences. And she's just like, I'm not diagnosing you, but I do want to validate you that everything you've told me I have heard from late diagnosed autistic adults. And that really kind of opened the door and that saved my life because I'll always say that, well, when I found out, I was kind of like, when I realized, because words are very special to me and found out isn't the right way to say it. When I realized there was just this kind of like shock, this bomb that had gone off inside of me. Um, I was in complete kind of like, I was so relieved, but also horrified that like this mask I had created myself, I felt that it was like entombing me, like burying me alive almost. This mask that I had created to smile and to seem fine, like I felt so disconnected from who I truly was that I felt like inside of this 34, 33-year-old adult was a child who had stopped growing and stopped developing because her needs were never met or understood. And that there was this huge dissonance and disconnection. And that, like, essentially the separation was so huge, I felt like you could run, a mile through it. And that essentially I was dying too. Like the separation between the child who stopped being seen and understood to like morphed into the adult who was faking it and didn't know how to swallow water and doesn't know how to like use her hands properly or chew, like was just so severe that I felt like completely horrified, like that I could have gone any more moments in life without knowing. It was just so traumatic, so traumatic. And it just was like, it felt like a miracle. I was like, how did this even happen? Like, because it felt like roadblocks and roadblocks. Like, no, you're not autistic. You're too social. Like, no, 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 no. But as soon as I punched through, I'd say to Amber that it's like, that all I had essentially these like tabs in my head, 1,000 tabs open, and everyone had an equation and it was solved for X. And I was like, I was always tired and exhausted because I had 1,000 tabs open in my brain and all of them had an equation on the tab. And as soon as I put autism in for X, it solved each equation and it closed all the tabs. And I shut down my computer because I was like, dang, like I need to rest now. Like it just was completely exhausting to have these constant questions and not have them solved. But autism has like solved all the equations and it goes hand in hand with the research, and research is talking about how autism runs in families, how where there are autistic children, there are autistic parents. And then when I had my aha moment, I like just looked around my whole family and was like, ah! Like it was like so clear and horrifying. And my dad passed away 10 years ago now, but I was like, you were the biggest autistic in the world. Like it's just, and then I came to Amber and was just like, what do we do? Like families, like they don't know, they wouldn't know, they just think A, B, C, D. And I can talk more about this, but like um, autism in adults who are not diagnosed but have autistic children. Certainly, if you're of other culture, but it still applies to any culture, it hides from itself. It's so hard to see. And where there's any smoke, I would look for fire for sure.
Yes. Oh my God.
Sorry, I talked a lot.
No, you okay? First of all, your metaphors are amazing. It really does like bring it back so well. Amazing. Um, okay. I'm recognizing several themes in what you're talking about, and one of the really big ones though is masking and trauma. And I know that masking is a word that we're hearing a lot of lately in this world, and I would love if we could talk about what is that. What is masking? What is a trauma response? If you could explain that, Amber, if you have any thoughts as well, completely open.
Sure. Daniela, do you want to give your perspective? And then I can sort of chime in with kind of like the research on masking and things like that.
Sure. So I think something I'll say to start is that I think I like to make sure that I speak and I situate my context really clearly because I don't like speaking outside of my sphere where I feel safe and somewhat certain. And so I have my experience from Peruvian American, I think somewhat generally I could say Latino culture. Um, and it doesn't speak for all masking, and there's not this like universal conclusion about what it is. And I really think the phylos that come into to create the term is a better way to understand it. Like masking for Latinos, for example, had a lot to do, what I will say, with um, not being seen as different, not being out of community, making sure you had control over your children and their behaviors. And this is certainly of a different era and is seen at some point now, but there's some breakthroughs, that your children could do the rituals that kept them part of culture, like saying hi, saying goodbye, greeting people, making eye contact, giving hugs. And, already those things completely opposite perhaps from choice, individual choice, right? Which is so important, I think, generally, I can say safely to autistic children, and autistic people. And so it's really this, I like to look at culture as a really great parallel to what masking is in general, because I like to look at the Latino culture, I should say, because I think its strong tenets of like markers of belonging are a little subtler in other cultures, but are more clear in the Latino culture, right? Like the ones I just said. So, you learn all of those things, and essentially at some point, you are scared enough or punished enough, in my case, and I don't think that's the only way, perhaps. Um, but this is late diagnosed, undiagnosed autism. So those are the only two I can think of how you get an autistic child to not look autistic, is through punishment and through fear. Um, and so you essentially teach them through those methods and those means to perform the behaviors that integrate you into society, because that's where they feel it's safe. And so masking is these, I think, this passed down generational, I think it's greatly influenced by parents and by people around you, that they show you how to stay safe as they know it. And I think it's inherited because I think autism runs in families, and I think those things were taught to them by their parents, and with, of course, greater nuance to the conversation these days. But I think essentially masking is, in my experience, pushing down your individual needs and kind of like disassociating, um, and allowing for, without consent and without permission and without knowing how the damages it's going to cause you, you find it safer to be disassociative. um, and this is all perhaps even subconsciously, because there's a huge debate about whether it's a conscious decision or not to mask. um, but I think, and they just kind of move forward to make you look fine, safe, and just like all the other kids.
Yeah.
I'll add more, Amber, if you want to add
Sure. No,
something to
that was
that.
beautiful. And I can kind of give the research kind of big picture side of it. So Danielle and I are such a great team because, as you
Yes,
can see,
you
Daniela
are.
is so brilliant and tells these stories and has this amazing,
Yeah.
rich, nuanced perspective, not only on her own experience, but culture, right? And then I can sort
Mhm.
of give the kind of like researchy scientific, and how they merge. But, there have been really interestingly, several issues as the internet and social media took off. A lot of autistic and neurodiverse and neurodivergent people found that to be a really accessible place to
Mhm.
find other people like them to communicate, right? I can type when I need to type, I can asynchronously communicate. um, and there's been a lot of advocacy and activism. And what's really interesting is a few issues like masking started in conversations that autistic people were having with each other online, like, hey, do you do this? Does this happen to you? Do you experience this? And researchers have slowly, very slowly, been kind of like learning to listen to those conversations and then go, huh, there's something there. And so masking, in my view, was already being talked about among autistic communities online. And researchers kind of caught wind of it, especially it would sort of come up in qualitative research. So you're interviewing an autistic adult and they mention it, and researchers are like, what is this? And it was around the same time where we had a few decades of research showing disparities, racial and ethnic disparities. So we had a few decades of research showing that white children, white boys especially, were much, much more likely to be diagnosed. And there was enough evidence that that was not due to any genetic factors, right? There were sociocultural factors, access to a diagnosis, how a certain behavior is perceived in a white male versus a black male or versus a Latina girl, right? Because we don't have a brain scan or biomarkers to go, this person's autistic and this person isn't. We have to have clinicians using best practice tools, but also their own kind of judgment, and clinicians are often gatekeepers to the diagnosis. So we had years and years of knowing, oh, wait a minute, there's some disparities here that shouldn't be there, right? They reflect inequity. And then we started to try to kind of do things about those. Now, this whole time, girls were being identified at a 3 or 4 to 1. So boys to girls, 3 to 1 or 4 to 1 ratio. And everyone sort of just was like, yeah, genetics, that's it, right? Now, it's very nuanced, and for the most part, researchers do think there is still a genetic component to boys being diagnosed more often. But as this conversation about masking was taking place, there was also this attention being paid suddenly in research to girls, and this beginnings of these conversations about, are girls, is there actually, maybe some genetic component, but it shouldn't be a 4 to 1 ratio? Are we missing some girls who are autistic? Were our tools that we use to diagnose based on what autism looks like in boys? What does autism look like in girls? And as that developed, there was more and more of this research on masking, and researchers even starting to well, how would we measure masking? What is masking? Can we develop tools, right? And so there's been a whole, body of research that's been very rapidly growing around masking. And I just love that finally researchers are slowly listening to these things happening online and what autistic adults are saying, because there's so much richness of lived experience. And then it kind of slowly works its way into, the literature. But some of that, research, and this is, I'll say this is debated, but some of that research suggested masking might be more common in girls and women. That is not to say it doesn't happen in boys. And one of the reasons that there's pushback about that is that among neurodiverse communities, there is much, much higher rates of gender diversity than in a neurotypical population. So many more people who identify as non binary or sort of complexities of identification, but don't sort of identify strongly as boy, girl, man, woman, right? And so all I'm trying to say is there's a lot of nuance there, and I don't want to kind of misrepresent this, but there's some evidence that girls and women, and you think about how girls are socialized, right,
Mhm.
might be more apt to mask. And the richness that Daniela has brought that is not yet in the literature, but we are working on it, is then the overlay of culture, right?
Yeah.
So what are the expectations for little girls? What are the expectations for little girls in Latinx culture? Many other cultures as well, right? This is just one that we know about because of the makeup of our lab. And so Daniela really brings a rich, nuanced perspective of it's for survival, right? And there's a lot of compassion that I hear in Daniela's perspective. So even as she talks about my needs weren't met as a child, she's also, when she looks at the data that we collect, the qualitative data, the stories, Daniela helps us see, yeah, these Latino families, for example, that we're interviewing, they're doing the very best they know how based on how they were taught, based on how they were taught, based on how they were taught. There's intergenerational trauma, and as Daniela beautifully was saying, if standing out is dangerous, if you are a minoritized culture or group and being different is dangerous, if you're a communal culture where community is everything, family is everything, it's dangerous to stand out. So this sort of the masking, the teaching a child to hide those things that you're doing, hide your stems, you
Mhm.
know, force yourself to do X, Y, Z. That's what masking is. And, it kind of gets to this bigger picture question related to any interventions that autistic children might get, which is, and this is actually comes from the broader disability community. To what extent
Mm.
do we try to change the person with a disability to conform, to fit into society? And to what extent do we try to change the context, society, to accommodate and accept the person with a disability? And this is like a really big issue, as you can imagine. And of course, as we parent our children, we're always trying to teach them things and help them be who they need to be in the world. But we have a whole generation of autistic adults saying, hold up. There were some things that I needed help with as a kid, right? And I'm glad I got help. But there's other things that I felt very shamed and I suppressed about myself. And just as
Mhm.
Danielle like beautifully said, I got disconnected from who I am. I had this existential crisis as an adult. Did it really have to be that way? Did I like did those stems hurt anybody? Or whatever. So I'm just trying to say this is like there's so much conversation about this happening online right now, and it's really important topic, obviously. And I love that Daniela gives us, and our other ALEC group members give us this lived experience perspective.
Yeah,
Can I jump in one more thing?
absolutely. Please.
So I wanted to thank you, Amber, for what you add. I definitely couldn't do what you do in that such clear, concise way. But yeah, so I wanted to share personally something I'll say for my story. It's just my dad when he was alive. I remember him so very clearly telling me that he was afraid for me.
Mm.
He just was like, "I don't know how you will survive in this life." He would call me Mother Teresa and would say like, "You just care too much."
Mm.
And it's funny because when my aunts talk about my father as a child, he was a bleeding heart, like gave away his own shoes to other children. And I just think, and he always would say, like, "You remind me of me."
Mm.
And it's just like, what is parenting if not keeping your children safe? And like, I just feel that in his case, my father like parented me to like try to make me tougher
Mm.
and try to like scare me so the world wouldn't scare me, like show me the edges so I didn't have to learn them on my own. And I don't think this is an unusual philosophy of parenting, and certainly I don't think it's unusual in a certain generation, in the Latino culture, Latina culture, Latina. Um, and I think it speaks to the root of what autism is when no one was looking, and in countries like autism just didn't pop up, I don't think. And for me, like if autism existed in me, I do think it came from my parents. And my dad was a little boy in 1949, 50 Peru, in the jungle, in a jungle rural town. Like I do think autism always existed, but it didn't always exist as we know it. And if it always existed, then it's almost like anthropological. Like I'm looking for the bones, I'm looking for the scent, for the stories, the textiles. Like, what's the proof? And what do I know about those places? In his case, what was accessible to coping was alcohol. What were men allowed to do? They were allowed to drink at night and gamble. Like, like culture has entry points for people to kind of assuage, to calm their beating heart, the things that they can accomplish in life. Culture has allowances for it. If we were to look at a culture almost anthropologically, I think these things existed, right? But in his case, his alcohol like eventually led to stomach cancer. You know what I mean? Like, and that's how he left the world. Like, culture has a solution, but they're not always the best ones. But who's to say, right? Like, I think he was coping with racing thoughts, bleeding heart, like not knowing exactly why he felt different than everyone. And then these statistics don't, I don't think, exist in isolation. Like Amber was speaking about the queerness and the non-binary numbers of autistic experiences. And so then put that on my parents from the 1950s, like when that wasn't necessarily safe to be.
Mhm.
Just a tiny, and I love the word queer, right? Just a tiny bit of queerness, like, or a great bit of queerness, like was not safe for my father to feel or experience, whether he did or not, whether he would say or not. But if that's part of an autistic experience, it's like, and of course, that's completely otherized in certain cultures and certainly in certain times and eras. Like, there is no allowance for deviation. And just recently, we were talking to parents, and one of them was saying that she knows for sure that her husband is autistic, and that's where her daughter has gotten it from. And but he, like, so what do you do with a little boy who is hyper attention, like super rambunctious, cannot be controlled? Well, he doesn't make it past fifth grade. And then what happens to him if he lives in this certain neighborhood? He goes into a gang. Like, it's like culture creates pathways for people who don't fit in. And it's not always the pathways you would want, because, like, he was in a gang and that's not what you know what I mean? Like, but culture also pushes people to the fringes, and they tend to be predominantly black and brown and people of color, and have higher risks at the fringes. It's not the same fringe that non-white folk people experience. So there are different consequences, and there's different safety nets and different supports. There's different understanding and different compassion. As you see a little, boy who's not paying attention, well, what happens to these little boys who are black and brown, who are not paying attention, who could perhaps be autistic? We just see them as troublemakers, right? So it's a completely different set of rules, consequences, different safety net, different fall, like, and it's completely, I think, connected to neurodiversity.
Yeah. Daniela, what you said, just, it's like so beautifully bittersweet, just all the things you said about your father and your experience with him, and how in his own way he felt like he was looking after you by, um but then it's like, okay, now we're, as a society, hopefully trying to take a step forward and make it a safer space, right? It wasn't safe, so that was how he felt. He was worried. And so I just think that was really beautiful how you said all of that. And Amber, I really appreciate you sharing the research behind everything. um, I'm so excited about this conversation, and I'm very, very grateful to have both of your perspectives.
Do you mind if I had one more
Yes,
thing?
absolutely. No,
I feel bad. I feel bad pointing out just my dad, because I will be fair and point out my mom. My mom was a teacher.
okay.
My mom was a teacher. And the only accommodations I got as a child was speech therapy,
Mhm.
because I could not say my ahs, my r's. And so when I was diagnosed with the need of, clearly I could not say my R's. I said chalk,
Mhm.
for shark, and I can still remember it very clearly. Is that she was they essentially told her, if as she remembers, like, you have a choice. Your child could maybe go into get special accommodations or not. And my mother, who was a teacher, thought that it was unsafe for me to be picked out of the crowd and to get special accommodations. She, as a teacher, a first grade teacher, felt that if I was given special education or isolated as other, then I would never recover. And recover to what? And this, I know, and this is where you unpack, you know, ableism, and like this idea of not wanting to be other and what is other and who's in the group of other. And now as an adult, I'm like, let me be other with you. Like, I have such solidarity. But at the time, she was just trying to make a decision for the rest of my life and was afraid for me to be otherized further in education. And what's funny, because, and so I blame my father, I blame my mother, and I want to do it equally because it's only fair. She was an educator, and I literally did not read until I was in 10th, 5th grade. And then all of a sudden, from nothing, from picture books of like so and so running around the bases and what is baseball that I hated, I read the Odyssey in 5th and 6th grade because I was like, this is fascinating. This is a poem. Like, this is very interesting. And I guess, like, I didn't learn anything in elementary still. I'm still struggling to do math. And my whole life was about don't get help, just make it through. And I do put that a little bit on my mother of just, I was giving my teacher massages and, nicely, like, hi, teacher, because I learned to be sweet to get like an E for excellent in 2nd grade to keep going. I was always most improved. There was no actual learning. I'm not sure I know anything, honestly. Because that's what masking is, in a sense. Like, there is no what do you need and how do you need it so you can learn, so you can grow. It was like fly by the seat of your pants so you don't have to learn the thing everything everyone else is learning because it has been told to you that you're not allowed to have that need. So it was being sweet, it was being hyperverbal, it was being very obedient everywhere else. And it's just like it just cuts off pieces of you because, like, I think I would have rather learn and then fight on the schoolyard if I wanted to, and not have this pressure of being a perfect little girl all the time.
Right.
That reminded me
Danielle.
also, I forgot to say, if that's okay, Taylor, just to
Yeah.
tack on to that, that in that growing body of research about camouflaging or masking, and is it more common in women, and what are women, because of course women can tell us more than like a young child, right, about their whole life experience with it. But what started to come up is that there are actual health risks of masking. And there's definitely the risk of getting overlooked by healthcare providers because you seem fine and not getting your health services needs met, not getting the help and support that you need. So I wanted to make sure that I said that part of the concern, and Danielle has spoken to the exhaustion, the disconnection from self, but there also are some kind of concrete kind of research quantified health risks. And so there's these conversations about unmasking, but where is it safe for people to unmask? So anyway, I just wanted to say that, and I see, Danielle, you have a follow-up.
It's like I don't know how not to pancake things. Like, you speak, I speak, you speak, I speak. Like, I'm not sure if I have to end everything, but it continuously
It's perfect.
keeps going. One of our colleagues at USC, Ellie Taylor, did a presentation about, I think, this topic and is very interested in. She is an expert. I also want to say, and I don't want to kind of necessarily tell my story about it, but I will say it's so dangerous for these girls to grow up. Like, as it, for me, like, as you try to navigate partnerships and relationships and like violence to women, like, and sexual violence, like if safety is fawning and freezing, like, it's just, and you don't know how to not go with the flow, and you have a heightened sense of danger because, like, everything's dangerous because if it was easy you would think they would have accommodated you, right? So it must have been hard to give you your needs, and life is a chronic state of fight or danger. Like, the outcomes and the situations I found myself in as adult that I directly attribute to my undiagnosed autism, like that were so dangerous and so unsafe and had literal consequences on my life, were huge. It's like not only do I dislike doctors because they patronize by the whole and large and don't know what they're saying and da 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 like and don't believe anything any me whatever I say feels like in addition to that, not feeling like you can rely or trust the safety net that should be health, these professionals that should be there and there for you. It's like there's also like violence and actual consequences that are just. I was talking to a mom about this the other day in an interview, and we were just kind of like both had our like mouths open, just imagining. And she said she wanted to raise confident children,
Mhm.
and I was like, yeah, because like the the land forward is just full of dangers for a vulnerable girl who doesn't know how to say no and doesn't know how to go against the flow and is always perceiving danger. It's just so dangerous for an undiagnosed girl, I think, in a way that is unique and very different to men because of the culture that it is. I mean, if we were living in a different world in a different land where misogyny wasn't the base of our American culture, then maybe it would be safer. But it isn't. It in the culture it is. It's completely dangerous and TBD.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And one thing I'm thinking while you are saying that, it's the danger for undiagnosed girls, that I heard that phrase. Now I'm thinking, okay, for our audience listening, for parents, what does that mean for parents? Where do they go from here?